When Mastertronic launched in 1984, with no history in the software industry, they needed to build a games library quickly. To do this, they turned to other publishers to license a number of their titles for re-release. Galactic Software, run by Richard and David Darling, was one, who provided a large number for the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20, but some of the more well-known titles were sourced from Welsh publisher Mr. Chip's Software. One of the most memorable from this first batch of Mr. Chip games was the slot machine game Jackpot, written by Sean Southern, originally for the VIC-20 and then later converted to the Commodore 64. This was re-released by Mastertronic under the slightly revised name of Vegas Jackpot and featured brand new cover art from Mark J. Brady. Vegas Jackpot went on to be Mastertronic's sixth best-selling game of all time, released across no fewer than 7 different formats and selling over 310,000 copies over a 2-year period. Unlike modern arcades, growing up in the 1980s, the typical arcades found in the likes of Blackpool and coastal towns across the UK weren't packed with skill and tickets-based games and claw machines, but instead old arcade favourites like the Donkey Derby and true arcade classics like Space Invaders, Galaxians and countless others. But amongst all the coin-op hits and 2p coin pushers, slot machines were readily available to people of all ages. While there were the mysterious areas sectioned off in arcades for over 18s, back then we had access to a plethora of 2p and 10p machines that we were able to play as kids. The gambling laws in the UK made these machines accessible to children because of the different categories awarded to slot machines. In these cases, because of the low cost per game and low maximum prizes on offer, they were classed as Category D machines by the gambling commissions, with no restrictions on who could play them. In fact, they were given the same status as most coin pushers and claw machines. So with children playing them in the arcades, it is no wonder that they'd make their way onto the home and become one of the most popular game genres regardless of the computer or console that they were released on. So it's no surprise that Mastertronic wanted to open up their range by releasing such a game. Of all their 8-bit games, this was released on more formats than any other game. In fact, the only 2 systems that didn't see a conversion of the game were the Amstrad CPC and MSX. But of all 7 versions of Vegas Jackpot that Mastertronic released, which version was the best? Keep watching and find out. As we said at the start, contrary to what many might believe, the game started life on the VIC-20, and the programmer Sean Southern managed to squeeze the game into just 5k of memory on the unexpanded VIC. Sales for Mastertronic were impressive, reaching close to 50,000 copies. This turned out to be an extremely impressive slots game for the VIC-20, presenting the player with 4 reels, something that no other commercial VIC-20 slot machine game offered, and kept a low stakes play in line with what was allowed for children in the arcades at the time, perhaps to fit with what the perceived audience was for the VIC-20. Even though it uses a quite bright colour scheme, all the reels are easy to make out and the game runs smoothly and plays incredibly well. It's undeniably the closest recreation of a real slot machine that you will find on the VIC-20. As with the VIC-20 original, Sean Southern took the helm once more to create the Commodore 64 version. As before, this too was first released by Mr. Chip's Software under the Jackpot name, but even so, it still managed to sell an impressive 74,000 copies second time around, when it was re-released as part of Mastertronic's first wave of titles in April 1984. The core game remains the same as the VIC-20 release, spanning 4 reels and offering all the standard features from a slot machine, but with the obvious cosmetic improvements with great visuals and extremely smooth spinning reels. Considering the impressive sound capabilities of the Commodore 64, the sound is rather disappointing and is limited just to a few sparse sound effects and brief single channel tunes when the game loads, as well as when you win or lose the game. To be fair to Sean Southern though, this was released early on in the C64's lifespan, when a number of games were produced by a single developer who is responsible for coding, graphics and sound, so this is forgivable. Cosmetics aside, there is one key difference to the gameplay from the VIC-20 release. Instead of allowing gameplay to continue ad infinitum or until you run out of cash, there is a specific goal to reach. You start with £100 cash, spending £1 per play, with the overall objective of having £250 cash in your possession to beat the game. It does add an extra level of excitement, missing from most of the slot games that give it that one more go appeal. The port to the ZX Spectrum by a programmer known only as CME was the first version of the game that was not developed by Mr. Chip, and it is essentially a completely different game, just sharing the same name as the original. With 10p stakes and a maximum £2 prize, it replicates the more basic machines found in arcades at the time, offering simple hold and nudge features. Unfortunately, where this version struggles is in its speed, as it runs at an unbearably slow pace, with reels taking several seconds to lock into place. For something that should be a fast-paced release, there's no thrill or excitement to this one whatsoever, and is easily the worst of all the versions released. Work on developing the Dragon 32 version of the game was completed on the 14th of August 1984, but the game wasn't released until January 1985. Unlike most of their releases, this conversion was commissioned specifically by Mastertronic, who paid the authors Jeff Campbell and Jason Orbaum the sum of £500 outright, roughly £1,600 today, for their work on the game. Unlike the others, this is played in complete silence, but as with the Spectrum release, plays on just 3 reels. It does run significantly faster though, but despite having more basic visuals, it's still a fun slots game, and as well as having the expected hold and nudge features, you can gamble your winnings. It has one of our favourite personal gimmicks found in a lot of arcade slot machines, offering random holds after a win, allowing for potentially unlimited wins in a row. This was Mastertronic's second and final game for the Dragon, and sold just over 2,000 copies, considerably less than their previous release, and was possibly the reason why the system was not supported after this, even though other publishers continued to support the machine beyond that time. Vegas Jackpot was converted to the Commodore 16 by the original author, Sean Southern. This turned out to be the most successful version of the game in terms of sales, managing to sell over 100,000 copies, and it was the third best-selling game for Mastertronic on the Commodore 16. As you would expect from Sean Southern, this proved to be an extremely faithful adaptation of the Commodore 64 game, with all the features and playability of that version intact. Visually, it takes advantage of the C16's greater colour palette, so it actually looks better than the Commodore 64 version, and whilst the sound effects are similar, they're not quite as good as they're a bit harder sounding. All that aside, it's a solid conversion, and it's a worthy challenger for the top spot. It's worth noting that if you own the original slow loading release and have a Commodore 16 Revision B motherboard, the loading screen will not display correctly, but the rest of the game loads and plays fine. The penultimate version of Vegas Jackpot to be released, the Atari 8-bit version, was released in May 1986, over 2 years after the VIC-20 and Commodore 64 versions. This sold just over 33,000 copies and was Mastertronic's 10th most successful game for the Atari. Converted to the Atari by Hal Rushton, this was based on Sean Southern's Commodore 64 release, but as it was written to run on the Atari 400, some compromises were made to the game. The gameplay itself remains untouched and still has all the same features and the same goal of reaching a total of £250 in your cash pot to win the game without losing all of your money, and by all accounts is exactly the same game. Sound again is quite limited to a simple tune once the game is loaded and some sparse sound effects throughout, but the main difference to the Commodore 64 version comes with the visuals. As this was developed to run on all the Atari 8-bit machines, it was designed to use only 8 colours, so some of the symbols on the reels do look rather strange at times. It runs just as smoothly and as quickly as all the Commodore releases and plays just as well, but this technical compromise does make it look the weakest of the 3 of this variation of the game. This was the final version of the game to be released in September 1986, some 2 years after the original. It was also Mastertronic's final game to be released for the BBC Micro in their original range. Once more, this was an original slots game rather than a conversion from the VIC-20 or Commodore 64, and it reverted back to the 3-reel format as seen on the ZX Spectrum. However, this version proved to be a fun and engaging title in its own right, with colourful and bold graphics, great use of sound, and all the usual features you'd expect from a slot machine, backed up with an easy-to-use control system. One particular thing to note was that, like the Dragon 32 version of the game, this too featured the random chance to hold all the reels after you had won. This was a favourite feature of those who had played on real machines and allowed for a quick and easy way to build up your virtual cash balance. A good game in its own right and worthy of the Vegas Jackpot name. First of all, special mention has to be given to the VIC-20 release for its technical achievements, managing to deliver arguably the best slot machine for the platform, even more considering it is running on an unexpanded machine. But as expected, it's the Commodore 64 version that steals the show, improving on the VIC-20 original with vastly improved graphics and sound, expanding on the gameplay with a goal rather than endless gameplay, and setting the standard for the later versions to aim for. Both the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 16 versions managed to deliver admirable adaptations of this, especially with their own hardware limitations. As for the others, with the exception of the poor ZX Spectrum release, they provide entertaining slot machine games. They feel like new games rather than conversions in the same way that Formula 1 Simulator delivered completely different games for different formats. But that's what we think. If you have a favourite amongst all of these, please let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss all our future content. And with that, we'll see you all next time.